There was nothing remarkable about the morning that marked the beginning of Amira Johnson's journey, except that it was meant to be perfect. The sky over Atlanta was a muted blue, brushed lightly with cotton clouds. Inside a modest house tucked into the quiet folds of Westview, an 8-year-old girl with luminous eyes and a heart full of dreams carefully zipped up her small suitcase. Her fingers lingered over the soft fabric, pausing just long enough to double-check that her most precious item, her flight journal, a spiral-bound notebook filled with colorful plain sketches and childhood aspirations, was safely packed inside. "All set?" Thomas Johnson asked from the hallway, adjusting his well-worn cap. Amira turned to him with a grin that stretched from cheek to cheek. "Almost, Papa. Just one more look." She dashed to the mirror. Her long braids were adorned with tiny beads, each one a soft clink of culture and personality. She wore a hoodie with a hand-sewn patch, "Future Captain." It was a birthday gift from her mother, a symbol of promise from a woman who had carved out a space in an industry that too often pretended not to see women like her. Today wasn't just about flying to Chicago. Today was a reunion, a long-awaited homecoming after 6 weeks apart from her mother, Captain Nadia Brooks, a woman who didn't just fly planes but shattered ceilings along the way. Amira bounded down the porch steps and into the passenger seat of her grandfather's Buick. Thomas gave her a knowing smile and started the engine. The car groaned gently into motion, its dash still bearing the faded sticker from his time as a United Airlines mechanic 3 decades ago. "Ready to fly, co-pilot?" he asked. "Yes, Captain Papa," she replied, giving him a mock salute. They both chuckled. The drive to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was filled with easy conversation. Amira talking about the paper airplane she made that flew across the entire classroom, Thomas reminiscing about the smell of jet fuel, and the days when he'd crawl under 747s like they were playgrounds. Neither of them knew that the laughter would soon be silenced. Inside the terminal, the world was a blur of rolling suitcases, murmuring announcements, and the scent of overpriced coffee. Amira held tight to her grandfather's hand, her eyes soaking in every detail: the electronic departure boards, the busy people in uniforms, the airplanes taxiing outside wide windows. Gate B23. There it was. They reached it just in time to catch the last few moments of a boarding call for another flight. A wave of passengers disappeared down the jet bridge, leaving behind a waiting area that slowly began to quiet. "Still got time," Thomas said. "Let's find a spot." They chose 2 seats near the windows. Amira pulled out her journal and began sketching a wide-body plane she'd seen moments earlier. She added little stars to the wings and drew a small figure in the cockpit, her mother smiling. She started humming. It was soft, a gentle tune, the melody her mother used to sing as she tucked her into bed. "Come fly with me." A song that floated through her memory like the breeze outside the jetway. But not everyone heard it as music. Across the aisle, a sharply dressed woman with platinum hair twisted into a bun, the kind that looked more like a statement than a style, lifted her head, her lips curled. And then she stood. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp like a winter wind. "Is this your granddaughter?" Thomas looked up, startled but polite. "Yes, ma'am. Something wrong?" The woman's uniform betrayed her authority. A flight attendant, Cheryl Patterson, according to the silver nameplate on her chest. She folded her arms. "We've had multiple complaints. The humming, it's disruptive." Thomas blinked. "She's just humming a lullaby. She's excited. It's been a long morning." "It's a public space, sir," Cheryl cut in, her tone condescending. "Others are trying to work or relax." Amira's pencil stilled. Her big, curious eyes turned toward the woman, who now loomed above her like a thundercloud. The melody died on her lips, replaced with a trembling silence. Her small hand reached for her grandfather's, but her gaze stayed locked on the attendant. Thomas forced a polite smile. "With all due respect, she's quieter than most kids I've seen running around in here." Cheryl didn't flinch. "We maintain standards, sir, inside voices." Then she bent ever so slightly toward Amira and added with artificial sweetness, "Do you understand, sweetie? No more noise." It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. A rehearsed superiority coated in saccharine venom, and it hit like a slap. Amira's sketchbook closed. The room fell still. Around them, passengers glanced away. Some pretended to be absorbed in their phones. One man nodded faintly, as if to signal approval for order being restored. No one stood, no one spoke. Except for Thomas. He cleared his throat. You know what? We'll move. Cheryl didn't stop him. She had already turned away, satisfied. But as they rose, Amira whispered, "Why doesn't she like my song?" Thomas knelt beside her and said gently, "Sometimes, baby, people don't see joy the way they should, especially when it shines too bright." Amira looked down. Mama wouldn't let her talk to me like that. A quiet fire began to smolder in Thomas's chest. "No, she wouldn't," he said, standing. He looked toward the jetway and smiled, because just then, at the other end of the gate, Captain Nadia Brooks was walking toward them. Captain Nadia Brooks didn't walk into Gate B23. She commanded it. Her stride was neither hurried nor theatrical, but purposeful, measured. The kind of walk that belonged to someone who'd weathered boardrooms full of doubt, cockpits full of storms, and corridors full of condescension. Her dark navy uniform was pressed to perfection, her pilot wings catching the afternoon light like a medal earned, not given. And on her shoulder, 4 crisp bars, the mark of authority. The mark of someone who had flown farther than they were ever expected to. She spotted them instantly, Thomas rising slowly from his seat, Amira clutching her sketchbook like it could shield her from the embarrassment still hanging in the air. Nadia's eyes flicked briefly across the gate, assessing the tension with a pilot's precision. The atmosphere was heavy, uneasy glances, uncomfortable silences, and that all-too-familiar ripple that followed a public act of quiet cruelty. She didn't need details. She already knew. Her daughter's face said it all. Amira's eyes lit up the second she saw her. "Mama!" Nadia's expression softened as she knelt to embrace her daughter. "Hey, my little wingspan. You've been flying without me?" Amira nodded into her shoulder. "I was humming. Like you sing." She said I was too loud. Nadia's gaze lifted, calm but sharp. "Who?" Amira glanced sideways toward the refreshment counter, where Cheryl Patterson now stood behind a cart of orange juice and coffee cups, organizing napkins as if nothing had happened. Thomas stepped forward. His voice was low but firm. "A flight attendant approached us and scolded Amira for humming, said people were complaining. But she wasn't disruptive, just being herself." Nadia rose. She didn't storm. She didn't yell. She walked. Passengers nearby stiffened slightly as the uniformed captain approached the beverage cart. Cheryl turned, a tight smile already forming, until she saw the stripes on Nadia's shoulder. The color drained from her face in a slow, dawning realization. "Is there a problem with my daughter?" Nadia asked, each word smooth and clipped. Cheryl blinked. I wasn't aware she was your daughter, Captain Brooks." "That doesn't answer my question." There was a pause, a thin silence that clung to the edges of the gate like a storm cloud. "She was singing," Cheryl said, regaining some composure, "and it disrupted the area." "Did anyone file a written complaint?" "No, but a few passengers." "Which ones?" Silence. "Because I see children throwing chips on the floor, toddlers screaming over tablets, and businessmen shouting into speakerphones. But it was my daughter humming a lullaby that drew your attention." Nadia's voice remained even, too even. Cheryl's throat worked like she wanted to answer, but she found no words. Nadia leaned in slightly, not to intimidate, but to be sure she was heard. "Let me be clear, Ms. Patterson. Amira Johnson is an 8-year-old girl. She was expressing joy, not causing disruption. And if anyone in this terminal staff or passenger finds that offensive, then they are welcome to confront me, directly." A hush settled over the space. It wasn't just about defending a daughter. It was about drawing a line. Nadia stepped back and returned to Thomas and Amira. Her arms slid protectively around her daughter's shoulders. "You okay, baby?" Amira nodded, but the smile hadn't quite returned. They found new seats near the window. Thomas exhaled slowly. "I was about ready to report her myself." "You won't need to," Nadia replied, "but I will." There was no bravado in her tone, no vengeance, just quiet resolve. "I didn't work 20 years to earn these wings so that my daughter could be shamed for having a voice," she added. "We will not shrink to make others comfortable." Minutes passed. The boarding announcement for United Flight 1876 echoed overhead. Pre-boarding for families with young children and military personnel. Nadia looked down at Amira. You want to see where the magic happens? Amira blinked. You mean the cockpit? I cleared it with the ground crew, Nadia said with a smile. You and Papa get a private tour. Come on, co-pilot. They headed toward Gate C16, which had been quietly updated due to internal instructions. As they walked, Amira's steps grew lighter, her journal hugged tightly to her chest once more. The emotional weight of the confrontation began to fall away, replaced by anticipation. This wasn't just an airport anymore. It was a threshold. The jetway led not onto the plane, but down a quiet side corridor. A special clearance had been arranged. A waiting ground operations specialist in reflective gear greeted them with a grin. Captain Brooks's VIPs, right this way. Thomas raised an eyebrow, amused. Getting the red carpet treatment now? They were escorted down to the tarmac, where the world of engines, fuel trucks, and flashing lights hummed in perfect rhythm. For Amira, it was a wonderland. Her head swiveled from one marvel to the next, her eyes catching the intricate choreography of aviation like a scene from her dreams. Papa James, she whispered, look at all this. I remember every sound, he said, touched by nostalgia. Every bolt, every checklist. Ahead stood the aircraft, a United Airlines Boeing 737, sleek and powerful against the afternoon sun. Its forward cabin door was open, the stairway lowered, awaiting their approach. Amira paused at the bottom of the stairs. Nadia turned to her and said, Are you ready to see where dreams take flight? With one final glance toward the sky, Amira nodded. Yes, Captain. The metal stairway clanked softly under their feet as they ascended toward the open cabin door. Each step Amira took felt like a passage between two worlds, the world that tried to hush her joy and the one where her voice would be heard. At the top, they were greeted not by coldness, but by warmth. Welcome aboard, said a kind-faced flight attendant named Lucy Martin, her voice genuine and inviting. Her navy scarf rested neatly over her shoulder, her name tag glinting under the sunlight pouring into the doorway. She offered Amira a broad smile, the kind that reached the eyes. You must be Captain Brooks's daughter. Amira nodded shyly, half hiding behind her grandfather. She's the co-pilot today, Thomas said with a wink. Honorary, of course, Lucy chuckled. Well then, co-pilot Amira, would you like to step into the flight deck? Amira looked at her mother. Nadia nodded. Go on. Let's show you where the real magic happens. Together they stepped into the cockpit, a small, complex cathedral of dials, screens, and switches. The hum of powered instruments and the faint scent of aviation-grade materials made the space feel sacred, like the engine room of the future. Wow, Amira whispered, her eyes round with wonder. Nadia gestured to the left seat, the captain's seat. Want to sit here? Amira hesitated, then climbed in carefully. Her feet didn't reach the pedals, but her presence filled the chair just the same. She looked out through the windshield at the world stretched wide before her. The ramp, the runways, the blue beyond. This is your office? She asked. Nadia smiled, adjusting a few knobs gently. Every day, this is where I decide how high we climb. Thomas remained at the door, arms crossed, watching both of them with the quiet pride of a man who had spent decades behind the scenes, so that moments like this could finally take center stage. His eyes misted, though he wouldn't say so aloud. Amira looked up at the overhead panel. There are so many buttons. Each one has a job, Nadia explained. Just like every person. Some light the way, some help us breathe, some guide us home. Amira traced her finger along the flight path displayed on a glowing screen. And we're going to Chicago? That's right, her mother replied. Flight 1876, 2 hours and 15 minutes of sky. We'll be flying at 36,000 feet. Amira sat quietly, absorbing it all. The instruments, the jargon, the view. Then slowly a smile crept back onto her face. The same smile that had vanished back at Gate B23. The same spark that Cheryl Patterson had tried to extinguish. Nadia leaned in and whispered, No one gets to dim that light. You hear me? Amira nodded. We fly anyway. As they exited the cockpit and stepped into the front of the empty cabin, Amira's fingers still buzzed from the experience. Her notebook was already back in her hands, sketching feverishly, her memory committing every detail of the flight deck onto paper before it faded. But the moment of calm didn't last. Standing at the forward galley, stacking plastic cups with mechanical precision, was Cheryl Patterson. The very same. Her expression changed the instant she recognized them. For a heartbeat she froze, caught between professionalism and discomfort. Thomas caught it too. Her posture, once upright with authority, had stiffened, not with pride, but with self-consciousness. Nadia stepped forward, calm but firm. "Good afternoon, Cheryl." "Captain Brooks," she replied stiffly. "I didn't realize you'd already boarded." "I wanted my daughter to see the flight deck," Nadia said evenly. "It's important she understands where she belongs." Cheryl's gaze flicked toward Amira, then quickly away. Thomas stood protectively beside his granddaughter. "I suppose now you see her as more than a noise complaint." Cheryl opened her mouth but found no words. The air hung thick. Nadia turned to Lucy, the kind flight attendant, who had been observing quietly. "Lucy," she said, her voice steady, "please prepare row 8 for our special guests." "Of course, Captain," Lucy replied, her smile unwavering. Nadia crouched beside Amira, her voice dropping to a gentle tone. "You and Papa will sit just behind first class, where you'll have extra leg room and a perfect view of the wing. I've got to run through the pre-flight checklist, but I'll see you just before we push back." Amira nodded, still scribbling into her journal. "Can I draw the whole plane when we land?" "You can draw the whole sky if you want," Nadia said. As they settled into row 8, Amira peered out the window, watching the ballet of ground crew vehicles moving beneath the wing. The world outside was alive with motion, but inside that cabin she felt still, strong, centered. Across the aisle, a businessman in a charcoal suit sat down with a huff. He barely glanced their way. Thomas noticed. Another one, he thought. Someone who would see the braids in the notebook and assume less instead of more. But it didn't matter anymore, because when the intercom clicked on a few minutes later, a voice filled the cabin, not harsh, not dismissive, but commanding and warm. "Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. This is your captain, Nadia Brooks. On behalf of First Officer Alvarez and the entire crew, welcome aboard United Airlines Flight 1876, service to Chicago O'Hare." Thomas watched the man across the aisle stiffen slightly, then glance at Amira. Amira sat taller. Nadia's voice continued. "We'll be cruising at 36,000 feet with a flight time of 2 hours and 15 minutes. We're honored to have you with us. Please sit back, relax, and prepare for takeoff." The hum of the engines slowly built beneath their feet. As the aircraft began to taxi, Thomas looked over at his granddaughter, who now stared out the window with anticipation crackling behind her eyes. She whispered as if reminding herself, "We fly anyway." And this time she said it not in defense, but as a declaration, a promise, a prophecy. The aircraft gathered speed along the runway with a graceful roar, engines rumbling beneath the cabin floor like distant thunder, steady and unyielding. Amira pressed back into her seat, her hands gripping the armrests, not out of fear, but exhilaration. Her wide eyes sparkled as the nose lifted, and the world below shrank into a miniature mosaic of roads, rooftops, and runways. Thomas leaned toward her. "How's my co-pilot?" Amira's reply came with a breathless grin. "We're flying." "Yes," he said, glancing out the window with a bittersweet pride. "Yes, we are." From the flight deck, Nadia guided the aircraft with calm precision. Her voice occasionally came through the speakers, offering updates on altitude and airspeed, her tone warm and authoritative. Passengers settled into the rhythm of flight, unaware that beneath the soft chime of seatbelt signs and the clink of beverage carts, something deeper was stirring, not just in the clouds they passed, but within the hearts of those seated in row 8. Amira pulled out her notebook again, opening to a fresh page. Her pencil danced quickly, sketching the silhouette of the aircraft wing set against a sky painted in gradients of blue. Below it, she drew tiny clouds shaped like hearts, stars, and music notes. Thomas watched her for a moment, the rise and fall of his chest slower now, more thoughtful. "She's changed," he whispered to himself. Not because she was drawing airplanes, but now she knew exactly why. A short while later, a soft turbulence rolled through the cabin. A few passengers tightened their grip on armrests, while a woman 2 rows ahead muttered anxiously and clutched her husband's hand. Amira, by contrast, remained still, her gaze fixed forward. "It's okay," she said almost to herself. "Mama says planes are supposed to move like this sometimes, like trees in the wind." Thomas turned, surprised. "She told me wings are flexible, so they don't break." His throat tightened. He placed a hand gently over hers. "That's right. And people too, sweet girl. The strongest ones bend, not break." Meanwhile, in first class, the tension hadn't disappeared. It had only taken on a more subtle form. Cheryl Patterson worked quietly, mechanically offering water and pretzels. Her smile taut, her eyes lowered. She moved with practiced efficiency, but her confidence had faltered. The words from earlier, the captain's measured tone, the weight of a mistake not fully acknowledged, it all clung to her like a scent she couldn't wash off. She avoided looking toward row 8, though she didn't need to. She could feel their presence there, strong, undeterred, and, perhaps most painfully of all, unbothered. Further up the cabin sat Gregory Barnes, the regional director for a corporate consulting firm, and a man who prided himself on his powers of perception. When Amira had first boarded, he had barely registered her presence. Another chatty kid, he thought. But something about the poise with which she moved now, the way she watched the world, not with fear, but with fierce intelligence made him pause. He noticed the flight deck door remained cracked open longer than usual before departure. He had noticed the small salute she gave to the pilot as she passed through the galley, and now the captain's voice had that unmistakable cadence. He leaned sideways in his seat and peeked toward row 8. Amira was drawing again. Her grandfather sat beside her, quiet and regal. There was a resemblance, his brow furrowed. He adjusted his tie, unsettled. Back at row 8, Lucy Martin arrived with a tray and a soft smile. "I have something special," she said, crouching beside Amira and offering a small pin in the shape of silver wings. "This is what we give to our honorary crew." Amira's eyes widened. "Really?" Lucy nodded. "You've earned it." Amira accepted it with both hands, the way one might receive a medal. She pinned it to her hoodie beneath the future captain patch. "Thank you," she whispered. Lucy turned to Thomas. "Captain Brooks wanted you both to have lunch early. She's asked the galley to prepare something a little nicer than pretzels." Thomas gave a small laugh. "Now that's service," Amira giggled. The sound, so recently smothered by shame, rang clear once again. Not just because the turbulence had passed, but because the skies inside her were settling too. Further into the flight, Amira stood and stretched her legs, walking carefully down the aisle. She stopped near the galley, her sketchbook in hand. Cheryl was there, organizing service trays. Amira hesitated. Then, summoning courage far beyond her years, she stepped closer. "Miss," she said softly. Cheryl turned, caught off guard. "Yes?" "I wanted to say, I wasn't trying to bother anyone. I was just humming." Cheryl stared at her, guilt flooding her features. "I know," she said quietly. "You didn't do anything wrong." Amira nodded, then opened her sketchbook to a new page and held it up. It was a drawing of a plane. Not just any plane, this plane, Flight 1876. She had drawn the seats, the windows, even the beverage cart, and at the top of the page she had written in careful, blocky letters, "We fly anyway." Cheryl's eyes filled. She blinked them dry. Amira turned and walked back to her seat, leaving behind not a lecture, not a punishment, but a picture, a mirror. Thomas smiled as she returned. "Everything all right?" Amira nodded and sat back down. "I just wanted her to know I'm not mad. Just flying higher." He exhaled, a proud, knowing breath. And that's how real change begins. Above the clouds, Flight 1876 sliced through the sky with quiet grace. Inside, a little girl reclaimed her voice. A mother prepared for what would come next. And a man who had spent decades enduring silent prejudice watched the world, finally begin to turn. The sky beyond the window of Seat 8A stretched endlessly, brilliant, blue, and boundless. Amira sat with her forehead lightly pressed to the glass, watching the clouds roll by like a soft, eternal sea. Her pin gleamed faintly on her hoodie, silver wings beneath the words, "Future Captain." A quiet promise stitched in resolve. Across the aisle, Gregory Barnes had been stealing glances. at first out of idle curiosity. But now he was watching in earnest, drawn not by spectacle, but by something subtler, poise. Amira was calm, not subdued, not silenced, composed. She held herself like someone who knew exactly who she was. And for Barnes, a man who'd made a career assessing leadership potential, that kind of self-possession in a child was rare. He cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said, leaning slightly toward Thomas. "Is she your granddaughter?" Thomas gave a courteous nod. "She is. She's remarkable." Thomas's lips curled with restrained pride. "She's her mother's daughter." "Captain Brooks?" "The very one." Barnes sat back slowly, as if the final piece of a puzzle had just clicked into place. He had seen Captain Brooks's name on the digital manifest, but hadn't realized it was that Brooks, the pilot who had once made headlines for safely landing a 757 after a severe hydraulic failure. The first black female captain he had ever heard mentioned in the industry briefing newsletter. He'd skimmed it, of course. The story had felt distant. Now it was seated across the aisle, sketching airplanes and offering grace to the same people who had tried to mute her voice. For a moment, he didn't know whether to feel admiration or shame. Maybe both. Further forward in the cockpit, Nadia Brooks adjusted a switch with precise familiarity. Outside, high-altitude winds buffeted the aircraft, but inside the flight deck, everything remained measured. Steady. Her co-pilot, First Officer Alvarez, glanced at her. "You okay, Captain?" Nadia didn't answer right away. Her eyes were focused on the flight path, but her thoughts were trailing elsewhere, down the cabin toward seat 8A. "I will be," she said finally. Alvarez nodded. He knew not to pry. He'd flown with her before. She wasn't the kind of captain who brought emotion into the cockpit lightly. But today wasn't just another flight. Today was layered, not just for her, but for every girl who had been told to be quiet. Back in the cabin, the beverage service passed by again. Lucy offered Amira a small cup of apple juice, along with a warm cookie wrapped in paper bearing the airline's logo. "For the co-pilot," she said. Amira beamed. "Can I share with my grandpa?" Lucy winked. Generosity, another trait of a great captain. As they ate quietly, Amira pulled her journal into her lap again. This time she wasn't drawing the cockpit or the flight path. She was sketching faces, the kind she'd seen along her journey. Cheryl Patterson, Mr. Barnes, Lucy, even the gate agent with the deep laugh from earlier that morning. Each face had a name and a thought bubble above it, some filled with doubts, some with kindness, others with silence. And then, above all of them, she drew her mother, Captain Nadia Brooks. No bubble above her head, just a banner across the page that read, "We lead." Thomas looked over and smiled. "You're telling your story." "I'm telling ours," she corrected gently. A few rows ahead, Cheryl Patterson stood at the galley wall, taking a moment to steady herself. She hadn't spoken to Amira again, nor had she approached Captain Brooks since the initial encounter. But the image of that sketch, the one the child had shown her, lingered like a smudge on her heart. It wasn't the artistry, it was the words, "We fly anyway." She'd expected defiance, or worse, anger. But what she received was the truth, and that truth sat heavy in her chest. As the cabin cruised toward Chicago, an announcement chimed overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Brooks again. We'll begin our descent in approximately 20 minutes. We're expecting a smooth approach into O'Hare with partly sunny skies and light winds out of the west. It's been our pleasure to fly with you." Thomas looked at Amira. "Almost there." She didn't respond. Instead, she was writing something beneath her drawings, a short paragraph, neatly printed, every letter shaped with care. "Some people don't like your noise because it reminds them they've been quiet too long. But you don't have to get smaller for them. You just have to fly anyway." Thomas blinked. "That's quite a thing to write." Amira shrugged lightly. "It's what Mama says." He nodded. "Well, maybe the world needs to start listening to your mama." Amira turned a page and whispered, "It will." A few rows up, Gregory Barnes opened the airline magazine, flipping absently through articles about mileage points and travel hacks. But the words blurred. His thoughts drifted back to the child across the aisle, to her bravery, her clarity. He found himself wondering, when was the last time I listened to someone who had nothing to prove, but everything to teach? And for the first time in a long while, Gregory Barnes made a note in his planner that had nothing to do with business. Just 3 words: invite Captain Brooks. As the descent began, the nose tilting ever so gently toward Earth, the aircraft cut through the final layers of cloud like a promise descending into reality. A mother sat behind a flight deck full of instruments she had mastered. A grandfather sat beside a child who had rediscovered her voice. And a little girl, once told to quiet down, now carried the steady certainty of someone born to command the sky. She turned to Thomas one last time before landing. "Papa," she said. "Yes, sweetheart? When I grow up, I don't just want to fly planes." He raised an eyebrow. "No," she smiled. "I want to change who gets to fly them." The wheels of Flight 1876 touched the tarmac with a soft, confident thud. The plane decelerated gracefully, rolling along the runway under the masterful hand of Captain Nadia Brooks. From the cabin, the familiar symphony began. The gentle roar of reverse thrust, the hush of passengers adjusting themselves upright, and the quiet ding of the seatbelt sign turning off. Amira peered out the window, her breath fogging the glass just slightly. Beyond the wing, the city of Chicago waited, a skyline that shimmered in the afternoon light, unaware that one small passenger had just decided she would one day take it on by storm. Thomas leaned over, patting her hand. "Welcome to Chicago, my captain." Amira giggled. "We landed so smoothly, I barely felt it." "That's your mother's signature," he said. "She lands like an artist paints, steady and bold." Up in the cockpit, Nadia removed her headset, her hand still resting lightly on the yoke. A deep breath filled her chest, not from exertion, but from something more profound. She had landed hundreds of flights in her career, but this one was different. This landing wasn't just about arriving safely, it was about arriving seen. First Officer Alvarez looked over. "Nice one, Captain." "Thanks," she replied. "Let's finish strong." As they rolled toward the gate, Nadia glanced at the monitor showing the cabin. She caught a glimpse of row 8, Amira seated beside Thomas, her head tilted in quiet wonder. That alone was worth every flight hour she'd ever logged. Once the aircraft reached its parking position, the jet bridge extended with mechanical precision. The plane exhaled, doors opening, oxygen shifting, passengers rising in unison like waves retreating from shore. There was the rustle of bags, the squeak of overhead bins, and a rising murmur of post-flight chatter. But in row 8, Amira remained still. Her sketchbook was open in her lap, one final drawing half finished. The view from the cockpit, imagined from memory. A sky full of symbols, and below it, the silhouette of 2 pilots, one with a braid like hers, the other with proud shoulders and 4 shining bars. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" Thomas asked. Amira nodded, tucking the sketchbook into her backpack. As they rose to exit, they stepped carefully into the aisle. But before they could move forward, Lucy appeared beside them. "Captain Brooks would like to walk you out herself," she said. Amira blinked. "Really?" She insisted. They waited as the passengers ahead of them disembarked. And then, through the forward cabin door, Nadia Brooks appeared, still in full uniform, her presence filling the space with gravity and grace. She knelt to Amira's level, smoothing the crease of her daughter's sleeve. "How was your flight, co-pilot?" "The best," Amira whispered. "I wasn't scared once." Nadia smiled. "Neither was I." As they walked together down the jet bridge, Amira in the middle, hand in her mother's on one side and in her grandfather's on the other, there was a hush among a few of the passengers lingering at the gate. Some watched, some whispered, and Cheryl Patterson, standing just beyond the threshold of the aircraft, took a subtle step back. She hadn't expected this to be seen by the very family she had tried to diminish, and yet they didn't meet her with scorn. Nadia nodded once, controlled and firm. Thomas offered no expression. Amira looked directly at her, then turned back to her mother without a word. That silence spoke volumes. Outside, the terminal buzzed with activity. Families reuniting, professionals typing furiously on phones, announcements echoing overhead. But for Amira, the world had changed. She wasn't just in a new city. She had stepped into her narrative. As they walked toward the baggage claim, a familiar voice called from behind. Captain Brooks! They turned to see Gregory Barnes approaching, suitcase in hand, tie slightly loosened. He looked winded, like he hadn't meant to stop, but something in him refused to walk away without speaking. Mr. Barnes, Nadia said calmly. He nodded, eyes flickering toward Amira. I just wanted to say thank you. That was a remarkable flight. And your daughter, she's extraordinary. Nadia glanced at Amira, then back at him. She is. Barnes hesitated. I think our firm, Midwest Consultancy, is hosting a youth leadership symposium next quarter. I'd like to extend an invitation, if she's interested. Amira blinked. To talk, to speak, to share, to inspire. She looked to her mother for permission. Nadia gave a slight nod. Amira took a breath. Okay, but only if I get to draw while I talk. Barnes smiled genuinely and was surprised. Deal. He handed over a business card and disappeared into the stream of passengers. Nadia tucked it away in her blazer. Thomas leaned close. Your daughter just booked her first keynote. I know, Nadia said, pride pulling at her lips. She's just getting started. That night, in a small apartment just outside the city, the three of them shared a quiet dinner. Amira in her pajamas, her wings pinned, still fastened proudly to her collar. The television stayed off. The lights stayed warm. As Amira curled into bed, she held her sketchbook close. Mama? Yes, love. What happens now? Nadia sat beside her, brushing a braid away from her forehead. Now we keep flying. We keep speaking. We make room for other voices too. That's how we rise. Amira nodded slowly. Even when people want to be quiet? Especially then, Nadia whispered. Later, as the city hushed outside and the hum of traffic grew faint, Thomas stood by the window, watching airplanes descend in the distance. Dots of light cutting through the dark, each one carrying 100 stories. He closed his eyes for a moment and whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. Not just for a safe landing, but for the kind of journey that would echo for generations. A week passed. The story of what happened on Flight 1876 had not been intended for public consumption. But stories like Amira's, ones brimming with quiet defiance and sharp injustice, rarely stay contained. All it took was one photograph, a blurry but powerful shot of Captain Nadia Brooks walking hand in hand with her daughter down the jet bridge, silver wings gleaming under fluorescent light. The image appeared first on a travel blog under the headline, The Captain, Her Daughter, and the Flight That Defied Silence. Then it spread. People weren't drawn to the incident alone. They were drawn to what it represented. In a world exhausted by division, this moment carried something deeper. A mother who didn't erupt, but stood firm. A child who didn't retreat, but chose to soar higher. A family that turned pain into principle. And most importantly, a system that had once again tried to shrink someone and failed. In her modest office in Chicago's West Terminal, Nadia Brooks sat at her desk, reviewing road assignments when her phone buzzed. Captain Brooks, she answered. Captain, this is Jacqueline Marks with United's Internal Ethics Division. Nadia straightened. I'm calling about an internal review that's been prompted by passenger feedback, specifically surrounding the treatment of a minor on Flight 1876. A minor who, we understand, was your daughter. Nadia exhaled slowly. Yes, ma'am, that's correct. The airline has received over 130 formal emails, not to mention thousands of social media mentions. The vast majority expressed concern, and frankly, embarrassment, that a child was publicly reprimanded for something as benign as humming. Silence lingered. Then, would you be willing to participate in a moderated panel as part of our upcoming diversity and equity review? Nadia didn't hesitate. Absolutely. That evening in their apartment, Thomas Johnson was boiling pasta while Amira sat at the kitchen table, her sketchbook open. But she wasn't drawing airplanes today. She was designing something new. Papa, she said without looking up, how do you spell initiative? Thomas chuckled, stirring the sauce. You trying to start a movement already? Amira smiled. Maybe. She wrote carefully on the top of her page. The Sky Initiative, speak kind to youth. I want to make posters, she said. Put them in airports, like pictures of kids who fly, with headphones and toys and smiles, so nobody thinks we're being bad just for being happy. Thomas blinked, then crossed the kitchen and knelt beside her. He looked at her handwritten slogan, her small drawings of airplanes with speech bubbles that said, "Please don't shush me, and I belong here too." He kissed her temple. "That," he whispered, "is the future talking." At the same time, in a quiet hotel lounge just outside O'Hare, Cheryl Patterson sat across from her union rep, eyes heavy with unease. "Cheryl," the rep said gently, "I'm not here to scold, but we need to talk. HR has asked for a formal response." Cheryl looked down at the coffee in her hands, unable to meet her colleague's gaze. "I didn't mean it to be racial," she muttered. "That doesn't mean it wasn't." Cheryl's throat tightened. She was just humming. "Cheryl," the rep said softly, "she was being a child, and you weren't." The following Monday, United Airlines issued an internal memo to all staff. "As we continue our commitment to inclusive skies, let the incident on Flight 1876 be a reminder that dignity is not conditional. Our passengers deserve more than tolerance. They deserve a welcome." Nadia read the memo 3 times before forwarding it to her father and daughter. Attached was an invitation for her to design a training module for frontline flight crew, a new program titled Decency at 30,000 Feet. She smiled faintly, then typed her response. "Accepted, but only if the first slide includes my daughter's drawing." 3 days later, they returned to the airport, not to fly, but to lead. The Diversity and Equity panel was hosted in a conference hall just beyond the international terminal. The audience was a mix of crew, executives, ground staff, and press. At the front of the room, 5 chairs sat under soft lights. Nadia was the third panelist. Amira sat in the front row, her small blazer buttoned up tight, wings pinned gleaming like a badge of honor. She held her sketchbook in her lap, hugging it against her chest. "Captain Brooks," the moderator said, "you've flown over 2 million miles in your career. What made Flight 1876 different?" Nadia held the mic gently. "Most flights begin in the sky. This one began with silence." A pause. "But not ours. Ours began with a child singing." Some in the audience shifted, uncomfortable. "And it revealed," she continued, "just how often we silence what we don't understand. How often we mistake joy for disruption, especially when it comes in a voice we didn't expect. Especially when that voice is black, young, and female." She let that land. Then, "We don't need quieter children. We need better adults." The room went still, and then applause. Not thunderous, not performative, but sincere. Outside, under a stretch of terminal windows, Amira stood at a small easel, surrounded by a circle of journalists and airport staff. Beside her was her first full-size poster, a drawing of a black girl in a hoodie with a sketchbook on her lap, seated next to her grandfather. Above them, in bold blue letters, "We fly anyway." Beneath it, a message from the Sky Initiative. Amira looked up as her mother joined her. "Did I do okay?" she whispered. Nadia knelt, wrapped an arm around her, and replied, "You did more than okay, Amira. You landed something big." In the days following the panel, something subtle but unmistakable began to shift inside United Airlines, and quietly across the aviation industry. It didn't make headlines at first. There were no massive lawsuits, no televised apologies. But in internal forums on message boards, in whispered conversations in break rooms and gate lounges, people began speaking a little differently, listening a little longer, reflecting in ways they hadn't before. Because Amira Johnson, age 8, had shown them what most adults forgot: that dignity isn't earned by age, rank, or uniform. It's owed. The Sky Initiative took off faster than anyone expected. Within 2 weeks, over 400 employees across 4 regional hubs had downloaded the printable version of Amira's poster. By the 3rd week, the campaign had been formally adopted as part of United's internal employee onboarding series. It wasn't just a poster anymore. It was a reminder taped beside coffee stations, briefing rooms, and even tucked inside safety manuals. And Amira? She just kept drawing. When interviewed by a small local newspaper, she answered every question with quiet certainty. "Why did you create the Sky Initiative?" She had looked at the reporter calmly. "Because if they see us differently," she said, "they'll treat us differently." Then she added with a shrug, And it's easier to change how people see than to change what's already in their hearts. The journalist had blinked, then swallowed, then put the notebook down entirely. Meanwhile, inside the union offices at O'Hare, Cheryl Patterson sat across from a new HR officer, this time for a disciplinary hearing. But it wasn't combative. She wasn't being fired. Not yet. Instead, she had been offered something unexpected. A choice. Cheryl, the HR officer, said, "You've been with this airline for 12 years. You've logged thousands of flights. But after what happened, especially given the public attention, you have an opportunity to take responsibility." Cheryl crossed her arms. "And if I don't, you'll likely keep your job, but your name will stay on a growing list. And the court of public opinion doesn't hand out appeals." Silence. Then, "What's the alternative?" The HR officer slid a folder across the desk. On the cover, "See Me. Acknowledgement and Accountability. A program in response to the Sky Initiative. 4 weeks," and she said. "Guided workshops, story-based, led by the very people you once overlooked." Cheryl stared at the folder for a long time, and then quietly, "I'll do it." On a crisp Saturday morning, in a conference room lined with laminated posters of smiling crews and panoramic views of the clouds, the first cohort of the SEME program gathered. Among them sat Cheryl. She wore no uniform, no name tag, no defenses. In the front of the room stood Nadia Brooks, not as a captain this time, but as a teacher. Her voice was calm, deliberate. Her posture is proud. "Today," she said, "we aren't here to shame. We're here to surface the things that fly under the radar. The assumptions, the microaggressions, the habits we were taught to ignore." The room was silent. Then she gestured to the side where Amira stood next to a display board covered in hand-drawn illustrations. Children on planes, flight crews, families boarding, all in the same style that had become instantly recognizable. Cheryl inhaled sharply. Amira was part of the program. She hadn't just forgiven. She had volunteered to educate. "Do you remember me?" Cheryl asked softly after the session. Amira tilted her head, then nodded. "You made me stop humming." Cheryl swallowed. "I was wrong." Amira didn't flinch. She simply said, "I know." And then she added, not unkindly, "But you can draw with us next time. We're designing new posters." That evening, Amira sat in her room, her sketchbook open, her markers scattered like confetti. Thomas was on the couch reading a paperback novel, and Nadia sat at the dining table, replying to emails. But when she saw her daughter's latest drawing, she paused. On the page was a new slogan: "Voices at 30,000 feet matter too." Beneath it, a small, smiling drawing of Cheryl, no longer angry but holding a pencil and coloring beside Amira. Nadia said nothing at first. Then she crossed the room and sat beside her daughter. "You're turning everything that hurts into something that helps," she whispered. "That's rare." Amira looked up. "Isn't that what you do when you fly? Turn hard air into soft landings?" Nadia's breath caught in her throat. She wrapped an arm around her daughter and pulled her close. "I do now," she said. Meanwhile, news of the initiative had begun reaching further than anyone anticipated. First to Delta, where a group of black female pilots requested to integrate the posters into their mentorship outreach. Then to JetBlue, where a gate agent in Boston asked for permission to use Amira's drawings in a holiday training session. Even smaller regional airlines, some with minimal diversity, reached out, asking how they could create their own Amira. The answer came back clearly: start by listening to the ones already there. And in one small classroom in Atlanta, a guidance counselor pinned a laminated version of the Sky poster on the wall just beside the daily schedule. Under it, a sticky note with a student's handwriting read, "My voice matters too, even if I don't have wings yet." Later that week, as Nadia sat on another flight, this time as a passenger heading to a speaking engagement in Denver, she glanced across the aisle at a young white boy sketching airplanes in a notebook. His father, noticing her uniform, leaned across and said, "He wants to be a pilot too." Nadia smiled warmly. "Good. We'll need him." Then she handed the boy a folded paper. Inside, one of Amira's prints, her plane drawn in bright colors, soaring through clouds shaped like question marks and exclamation points. At the bottom in thick lettering, "You belong in the sky." The boy smiled. "So do you." She nodded. I already am. On a windswept morning in Chicago, inside a high-rise conference suite overlooking the city skyline, the Board of Operational Standards at United Airlines convened for an unscheduled session. For years, meetings like these were procedural, updates on fleet performance, incident reports, profit margins. But this time, the agenda was different. Printed at the top of the docket in bold letters, the Sky Initiative Cultural Implementation Proposal. At the head of the room stood Captain Nadia Brooks, no longer just a voice at panels or a respected name on flight rosters. Today, she stands as a policy architect. Behind her, projected on a crisp white screen, was one of Amira's original drawings. A black child smiling through an airplane window with a simple caption scrawled underneath. Passengers are not problems, they're people. Nadia let the image linger. Then she turned to face the board. For too long, she began, we've trained staff to monitor safety, service, and schedules, but not silence. Not the silence that surrounds subtle cruelty. Not the silence of a child told she's too loud for being joyful. Not the silence of employees who feel like they're only ever one misunderstanding away from a reprimand. Several executives exchanged glances. Nadia continued. The Sky Initiative isn't just a branding campaign. It's a compass, a way to help every voice in our cabins, from 2A to row 30, be heard, seen, and respected. She clicked the remote. A new slide appeared. See me, acknowledgement and accountability, required training rollout. What we're proposing today is this: a mandatory cultural literacy module for every new hire and existing flight crew, grounded not in abstract theory, but in lived experience. There was a pause. Then from the end of the table, a senior VP cleared her throat. Captain Brooks, this is bold, but it's also massive. Operationally, it will mean reassigning training hours, adjusting curriculum, allocating. Nadia gently interrupted. Ma'am, with respect, it'll mean we're doing the right thing. Silence and then a quiet nod. Another and another. The proposal passed unanimously. That evening, as Nadia stepped out into the golden hour of a Chicago sunset, she called home. Thomas answered, his voice carrying warmth even through the static. How'd it go? They approved it, she said. There was a long pause. You just rewrote the handbook, he finally replied. No, Nadia said, smiling. We just expanded it. Back in Atlanta, Amira was busy preparing for something else. Her school was holding a student showcase titled Voices of Change, and while most of her classmates were reciting poems or performing music, Amira had asked for an easel and a microphone. Her teacher had hesitated at first until Amira quietly explained her plan. Now, on the night of the showcase, she stood under the soft gymnasium lights, facing a crowd of parents, students, and teachers. Her silver wings shone under the spotlight. She flipped to the first page of her sketchbook. This is the airplane I flew with my mama, she said. It was supposed to be a normal day, but someone said I was too loud. She flipped to another page. So I drew what happened, and then I drew what should have happened. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Amira wasn't emotional. She wasn't nervous. She was exact. This, she said, showing a drawing of Cheryl now sitting beside her with a pencil, is what it looks like when grown-ups learn. She closed the book. Sometimes if the world forgets how to be kind, we have to remind it, with drawings, with stories, with truth. The applause came slowly, then built, not the polite kind, the kind that meant something had landed. From the front row, Thomas wiped his eyes. Weeks later, inside a brightly lit training center at Dulles International, Cheryl Patterson stood in front of her newest cohort. She was no longer a flight attendant. She was now a See Me session leader. I want to start today with a story, she said, clicking to the first slide. Amira's drawing filled the screen. The caption read, We fly anyway. I didn't always get this right, Cheryl confessed. I got it very wrong. But I'm here to make sure you don't. The room was still. I'm here because a little girl taught me something that 12 years in the sky never did. She pointed to the slide. This is your pre-flight check. For your heart. That spring, the Sky Initiative became more than a program. It became a movement. Amira's drawings appeared in terminals from Los Angeles to Newark. JetBlue hosted a traveling exhibit of student artwork inspired by her story. Delta rolled out a mentorship track named Wings. welcoming inclusion and nurturing growth in skies, citing the Sky Initiative as its inspiration. But for Amira, the world didn't feel like a spotlight. It just felt bigger. One afternoon, she and Nadia sat on a park bench, watching planes streak across the blue above. "Do you think they're listening, Mama?" "I know they are. Even the ones who were mean?" Nadia looked at her. "Especially them." That night in her journal, Amira wrote, "If the sky can hold everyone, then maybe the world can too. We just have to teach it how." On the first day of summer, the aviation world paused. Not for a delay, not for turbulence, but for tribute. Inside Terminal 3 at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, where years earlier Amira Johnson had first been told to quiet her joy, a new exhibit stood tall under the atrium skylight. Travelers rolled suitcases past its edges. Airline staff paused mid-shift to admire it. Children pointed. At the center stood a life-size display, an airline seat just like any other, except for the plaque engraved on the headrest. It read, "Reserved for every child who was told to sit down and be quiet." The Sky Initiative, founded by Amira Johnson, age 8. Below it, etched in brass, were the words she had written months earlier in her journal. "If the sky can hold everyone, then maybe the world can too." Standing in the crowd was Amira herself, now 9, same sketchbook, same spark, but taller somehow, not just in height, but in presence. Beside her stood her mother, Captain Nadia Brooks, and her grandfather, Thomas, both dressed in their Sunday best. Nadia had been promoted just 3 weeks earlier, Director of Cultural Development for United Airlines, a newly created role shaped directly from the movement her daughter had unknowingly sparked. "Do you want to say something?" Thomas asked gently, nodding toward the podium. Amira shook her head. "I already did." She pointed to the plaque. "They can read." Later that afternoon, a small press conference was held nearby in a quiet terminal lounge. Cameras rolled, reporters gathered. But it wasn't Nadia or Amira who spoke first. It was Cheryl Patterson. She stepped up to the microphone. No uniform this time, just a soft gray blouse and a pin that read, "See me, trainer." Her voice was steady but reverent. "I once told a child her voice was too loud," she began. "But the truth is, I wasn't afraid of her volume. I was afraid of her light." No one moved. She looked toward Amira. "But now I help others make space for light like hers. Because skies shouldn't just be navigated, they should be shared." Applause rose slowly, then built, this time not for a perfect statement, but for an honest one. Nadia followed her, speaking briefly. "Pilots know that even in clear skies, there's always something to monitor, something to learn. Today, we don't just celebrate a policy change. We celebrate a change in perspective." Then softly she added, "And we give thanks to the co-pilot who led us here." She looked at Amira. The next morning, a video went viral. It wasn't edited. No background music, no graphics, just a simple 90-second clip of Amira in the airport exhibit, standing beside the engraved seat, explaining what it meant. "My mama flies planes," she said softly to the camera. "But I fly ideas." She gestured to the plaque. "This is for every kid who got told, 'That's not your seat,' or 'Be quiet,' or 'Don't make noise.' But we get to belong too." The video ended on her final line. "You don't have to be big to be brave. You just have to take up your seat." By sunset, it had been shared 2.4 million times. A month later, on a United flight bound for New York, a new safety video aired. Amid the usual instructions about seatbelts and life vests, a fresh voice chimed in. Amira's voice. Recorded in the studio, she read one line, added at the very end. "And remember, every voice belongs at 30,000 feet, especially yours." The cabin clapped. Some passengers wiped their eyes. Meanwhile, schools began reaching out. Then libraries. Then the city councils. Not to Nadia, to Amira. One city mayor in Maryland wrote, "Our classrooms need sky. Our teachers need to see me. Our children need the courage your daughter carries like a compass." In response, Nadia took unpaid leave. Thomas built a small website. And Amira? She launched something new. Project Skylines, a traveling art and dialogue program that brought kids together to draw, discuss, and define what dignity looked like in their voices. No one told them to be quiet. On the anniversary of Flight 1876, Amira and her mother were invited to attend a special ceremony aboard a new United aircraft, a Boeing 737 MAX, freshly commissioned. The aircraft's tail had been painted with a special tribute, Sky 876, We Fly Anyway. The aircraft would serve as a flagship on family routes and education partner flights. Inside, Seat 8A had a custom headrest cover, embroidered not with a passenger's name, but with a promise. This seat is for the kid with a voice. May it always be loud enough to change the world. As Amira boarded for the ceremonial flight, a woman tapped her shoulder gently. It was Lucy Martin, the kind flight attendant from that day so long ago. "Still flying?" she asked with a warm grin. Amira nodded. "Every day." As the plane lifted into the clouds, Amira looked out the window. The clouds moved like memories, soft, silent, but always shifting. And she whispered to herself, not as a question this time, but as an oath, "We fly anyway." Epilogue. The moral. In a world that often mistakes stillness for peace and silence for obedience, the voice of a child can be revolutionary. Amira didn't shout. She didn't rebel. She simply refused to disappear. And in doing so, she reminded a global industry, and all of us, that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums quietly in a terminal. Sometimes it is sketched in a notebook. Sometimes it wears a pair of silver wings and changes how we fly. Not by taking over the sky, but by reclaiming her seat in it.